for the introduction, and thanks very much for the invite to speak over the next month. It's an absolute pleasure to be a part of the National Parents Council event again. It's a truly wonderful organisation, and I think the numbers that we've had interest in this is probably an indication of where we're all feeling we are at the moment in terms of these are unprecedented times. Our children are in a place of uncertainty. As parents, we're in a place of uncertainty. And I think from the point of view of as a globe, we're fairly in a place of uncertainty. Things keep changing all the time, and there is a considerable amount of anxiety around. There's a lot of worry, a lot of fear. And I think from the point of view when we're in that position, we tend to look at ourselves and see if we're doing enough, are we doing it right? And one of the things I would say to you is that, you know, for me, I think parenting is in and of itself an object of doing your best, and it's about good enough. And I think there's an idea that we can be the kind of perfect parent, but for me, the perfect parent is much like the unicorn. It's a mythical creature. And you know, sometimes people would say, you know, well, Colman is a parenting expert. I wouldn't for a second suggest that I'm a parenting expert, but where my expertise comes from is working with children and families for 25 years. And I think what I've tried to do over that time is to try and understand what it's like through the eyes of the child and what that relationship is like through the eyes of the child. And when we were talking about the plan of what we were going to cover, this was a no-brainer that this was the first one we needed to start, because the parent-child relationship is fundamental to everything that goes on in terms of afterwards, and that's right the way from toddler to teen. The issue around the parent-child relationship is that it is one that evolves over time. It's a fulfilling relationship, but one that it involves, I guess, a labor over time, which is invested upon, that the comeback comes at times when you need it. And oftentimes when we're building that relationship, it doesn't feel like it. It mightn't feel like we're on top of things or that we're doing enough, but be under no illusion that children that I've met throughout my career, they do value the time, and they value our attempts to try and get it and to try and make sense of their world. And I think from the point of view of, I think when we think about children and we think about parenting, there is a kind of an expectation around parenting. And I remember seeing this, and I'll read it out to you. There was a kind of an idea of how you be a perfect parent. And all you have to do is just make sure your child's academic, social, psychological, spiritual, physical, and nutritional needs are met. Being careful not to overstimulate, understimulate, helicopter, or neglect them. In a screen-free, processed food-free, negative energy-free, body-positive, socially conscious, egalitarian, authoritative environment that nurtures but fosters independence, is gentle but not over-permissive, in a 2-story home, preferably in a cul-de-sac, with a back garden and 1.5 children's space evenly apart, and not forgetting the coconut oil. And I think that's that notion of pressure and expectation. If that's what we believe it takes to be the perfect parent, well, then we're going to struggle. Because in my experience, having a connection with your child has nothing to do with that. Maybe this is something, parenting might be something we have overcomplicated. And I think it is about maybe going back to basics and trying to understand what it is that parenting is and how to do it. There is no one way to parent, and I think anyone who tries to peddle that idea is simply untrue, because to suggest that there's one way to parent would suggest that there's one type of child. And I think what parenting is a set of skills that are best used when they fit the circumstances that are in front of you. So I've had so many parents come to me and say, my children are so different from the first to the second, and one might be very meek and one might be very kind of robust, and they're trying to parent, and they're saying, I didn't parent them any differently. And it's not about what you did to make them that way, but how you react and respond to them. Maybe that's where the skill set is. And so learning to be good enough parent involves learning to tune into your child's behavior and understand what it is and what it means. So parenting essentially is an art of communication. It's about being adept at interpreting communication and responding in an effective way to it. And children are interesting in how they communicate. What I've found over the years of working with young people is that we're all 3-dimensional beings. We all feel, we think, and we do. In terms of children, the younger the child, the feelings are huge. They're big feelings. The thinking, very small, and the doing is very big. So we see a lot of behavior and we see a lot of emotion. And almost there's the idea of the cognition or the thought that goes into that is the piece that takes a time to develop. And as a parent, sometimes what we're trying to do is create the thinking, create the space between a feeling and a behavior. And almost what we're trying to do is provide children with language. And language is so important, because where language fails, behavior takes over. So when you are frustrated or angry or annoyed, it's the time when you go, ah, or you hit things or throw things. It's because there's no words to express how I feel. And where children are coming from, and teenagers, I think, where there's a lack of language or there's a struggle to be able to articulate language, that's when we see behavior. And most of the questions that I would get when I'm doing any sort of a parenting forum is about behavior. How do I stop behavior? How do I change behavior? Well, before you stop anything or change anything, you have to understand behavior. And what I'd say to you is every behavior has a function. And whether that function is to communicate, to attain visibility, or to do something, every child's behavior has a purpose to it. And we breathe, we move, we react, we do all these behaviors for reasons. And so as well refined and well adjusted as we are as adults, children don't have that. So we have to, again, try and make sense of behavior that oftentimes is miscommunicated. So children are, as I said, they're overloaded with feelings and experiences, and this will accumulate in excessive behavior. And that oftentimes means that children will say things that are really kind of hurtful, or they might say extreme things. And as parents, we can get understandably upset by that, but it's about the intensity of the feeling and the lack of language that creates that dynamic. And what we need to do is to regulate the emotion for the child and to try and get, because the whole process of childhood is about emotional regulation. So when you take your 3-year-old into Tesco's and they're having a kind of a tantrum because you don't buy them buttons, you're hoping by the time they're 19 they don't do that anymore. And when they are able to do that, what they've achieved is a kind of an emotional regulation. And when we see what the most appealing thing about children is their emotional exuberance, their joy, their excitement, and how involved they get in things, it would be naive to think that uncomfortable or discomforting emotions wouldn't have the same intensity as well, because they do. So when we're trying to be the role of regulator, how do we manage that? How do we do that? What we do is it's about having the right amount of power, control, and influence for the child. What oftentimes the problem is where we over-introduce a child to something that they're not cognitively, socially, or able for. So what we want to do in terms of parenting is to try and pace the relationship so that they don't feel overwhelmed, but they also don't feel kind of de-skilled. And I think from the point of view of whether we are, the risk we have currently is perhaps overprotection, and kind of that helicopter model of snow plowing children through and not allowing them to have adversity. The other side of that is children who are overwhelmed with adversity. So your ability to kind of manage and understand what your child needs and how to regulate their world for them is essentially how a child will feel safe with you, because essentially everything about the parent-child relationship begins with the feeling of safety. So it feels, and it's not necessarily about, you don't have to have the answer all the times, but you have to have the presence. And I would say to you, one of the things I would say when we're approaching parenting is that it's like sitting on a roller coaster with your child. You can't guarantee that everything's going to be okay because you don't know what's up ahead. So what you try to do is you try and snuggle in with the child and say, look, I don't know what's up here. I'm a little bit scared too, but whatever happens, we're in this together. And it's that sense of your availability, your presence, and your approachability, or the fact that you're trying to get it, or the togetherness of the experience automatically means that the child is in a position of safety, and they understand that there's an adult in the room who's trying to manage this for me. And I would say try not to underestimate that. The next thing that becomes kind of challenging as a parent is a thing that you'll hear very few psychotherapists or psychologists talk about. And the reason we don't talk about it is because we don't understand really what it is. And that's a thing called temperament. So some children who have a very shy or soft temperament, other children might have an abrasive temperament. And you cannot change temperament. It's really difficult to change it, but you can work with it. And when we're working with temperament, we're trying to kind of find that middle all the time. And I really think that if we pace that middle, and I've repeated this so many times over the pandemic, but I think it's something that we need to keep coming back to. In terms of mental health and well-being, the middle is always where you're at the safest. So if you think about all the things that we do, whether it's anxiety, work, stress, busyness, alcohol, gambling, whatever it is, when we get into the 8, 9, 10s, that tends to be when we run into trouble. Or if it's really low in terms of motivation or socializing, we're kind of isolating ourselves. The 1, 2, 3s, we tend to run into trouble as well. So 4 to 7 is where mental well-being is at its healthiest. It's that middle ground. And as a parent, in terms of regulation, what you're trying to do is when your child is up in the 8, 9, 10, which they will be, which is absolutely developmentally appropriate for them to be, it's about bringing them down from 8 to the 7 and 6s. And if they're under-motivated or perhaps overly shy or something, and they're down to 1, 2, 3s, it's trying to bring them up to 4. So parenting is that guidance and pacing of things that allows us to manage our children to find the middle, to try not to, I suppose, escape the extremes where the problems tend to happen. In terms of the other thing that we tend to do is, as parents, and understandably so, is we tend to react and not respond. And the idea is that reaction is very simply, it's responding to something based on how you feel, whereas a response is a reply to something in a thoughtful and measured way that best meets the need at the time. And I need to be very clear about this. This is not about having this kind of muted, robotic, always softly spoken approach. I don't subscribe to that method of parenting, and I think children need to see our range of emotion, obviously within reason, but from the point of view of how does a child ever know where the line is if they don't ever see us react? And as a parent, we sometimes give ourselves a hard time for reacting, and it's absolutely understandable that we would react and not respond all the time because it's an emotional thing. There's tiredness, there's extremes of worry, there's all these things going on, and I think as parents we need to kind of manage our expectations around that. And actually, if you come in and see your 4-year-old drawing with a crayon on your newly painted wall, and you let a roar or something out of it, that's an understandable reaction. But what you've got to do is try and manage it and measure it and repair it. And it's about approaching your child with that idea of showing that you can regulate, even when you are dysregulated, that you can come back down. The other thing is that the consistency of parenting is really important. And by that, I mean, in terms of the patterns, children will thrive off consistency, because consistency basically allows them it allows predictability and reliability. And again, that enhances that sense of safety, where the child feels safe, that the reaction that mum is going to have on Monday is the same as it's going to be on Tuesday, it's the same going to be on Thursday. And none of us are robotic and consistent all the time, but we have to strive for consistency. And where children will be unsure about things is where there's a discrepancy between perhaps one parenting style over another. And oftentimes that shows a kind of confusion around where the line is. And if the line isn't clear, the boundary won't be clear. And so they will test repeatedly to try and find out where that line is. So if mum is very lenient and dad is very strict, or the opposite way around, what I'm saying to you is there's nothing wrong with having a kind of a disciplinarian focus to your parenting style, but probably best if both are like that. Or there's nothing wrong with having a more bohemian kind of way of managing parenting, but both be like that. And so again, this kind of consistency and reliability, it's repeated time and time again when we talk about children and parent and that parent relationship, but it is about that. The other thing is that the parent-child relationship is an investment, and I work with young people with mental health problems, and I think what I would say, and this is reflected in the research as well, one of the best prognosis for a child with a mental health problem is parental understanding of the difficulty. So when parents get it and they understand what the difference is, and they can understand perhaps where to push and where to pull back, that's a real skill set that's developed, but it is a really, really important prognostic indicator of how well a child does. And so when you're trying to interpret behavior, it's about trying to understand. And I'll give this example, that if you have a teenager and she comes down to have her breakfast, and she goes to get the cornflakes and there's no cornflakes left in the box, and she looks over at her little brother who's eating this overflowing bowl of cornflakes. Well, if she throws the plate on the floor and smashes it and says, "I hate this family," and runs out into the back garden, the answer in that situation is not somebody buy more cornflakes. The question is, why is this happening? And it's about trying to understand why she reacted like that to it. Now, oftentimes in that situation, we're tempted to sanction and to say that's not acceptable, and it may well not be. But there are times, especially where teenagers are in it, where they're involved in it, that we need to give children what they need more than what they deserve. And again, because the behavior is so erratic, and we know from neurological function, the ability to maintain our moods and struggles as teenagers and small children, and toddlers and teenagers are not dissimilar in how they manage things. Your ability to have balance and equilibrium and manage that and keep that middle is crucially important. But so when we're talking about being connected and having a good understanding of your child, the key parts to what we need to notice are, and these are the skill sets, there are subtle inferences that we need to be clear about when it comes to parenting, and these are related to the difference between a need and a want. Our children will want lots of things and they will ask for lots of things, but they don't need a lots of things. So the ability for the parent to decipher the difference between the need and the want is really important, because then it allows us to maybe make decisions around rules and sanctions that we don't feel bad about or feel guilty about. And this would be something around, I would see huge amount of pressure. This is something we're going to talk about later in the series, the pressure for children to have phones and technology, and parents feeling that if I don't give it, they will be disenfranchised, or they won't develop, or they'll be left out. That knowing the difference between the need and the want in that situation, for example, would be really important. The second thing is the difference between a child who is unwilling and unable. And this is a really difficult challenge. So for a child who has maybe a learning challenge or is struggling to learn, but is unable to learn or unable to manage their anxiety, then forcing them into a situation and not allowing them to kind of struggle is not going to be helpful. And then if a child is unwilling, they're well able to do it, but are actively trying to act out that and refuse to do it, then sometimes enabling and facilitating that can be difficult. So the key element of parenting and having that good parent relationship is being able to decide the difference between what is unwilling and unable, and also being able to respond in the correct way. And again, we will get that wrong. That's absolutely understandable. The other thing that I think children, especially as we come to teenage levels, once you get really important that your child understands the difference between what it means to be listened to and what it means to be agreed with. And so the idea that most fallout is that nobody's listening to me. And it is that people are listening, but they're just not agreeing with what you want. So if a child, for example, if your 16-year-old says, I want to get a tattoo, you're not going to have to get them a tattoo to make them happy. You might say, I understand that you want that, but I'm making the decision not to do it. And I'm listening to what your argument, I'm listening to everything, I'm just not agreeing with you. And having that clear from the start allows, again, that the child or young person to be heard. And what I'll finish up with now, and I think I'm kind of coming towards the end of the time there, but the issue is when we're understanding something, there's 5 optimal things around an environment that are really important. And this is borrowed from psychology and psychiatry. The first one is containment. So first of all, the child has to feel safe. It has to feel safe in your company and in your relationship. And so that's not something that is created overnight. The safety of a relationship is created over time. The second one is about structure, and children need structure that is reliable, and teenagers need it as well. So we need to strive to be as consistent as possible, and where children know where the boundary is or where the line is, they automatically will feel safer within that relationship. The third piece is being validated. So if I feel heard, if I feel listened to, if I feel visible, even though that doesn't mean that I have to be agreed with all the time, but I hear that my opinion has been taken on board, it has been listened to, and it has been fed back to me. The more you listen, the less I shout. And that's a really important thing to try and grasp, that validating and hearing your child's experience will allow them to feel visible, and oftentimes will spare them having to misbehave to feel visible. Then being involved. And again, involvement is something that is very tricky to pace, but you want a child to feel involved enough that they can cope with it, but not over. So when it comes to something like the pandemic, you want a child to be vigilant enough to know about cough etiquette and sanitizing their hands, but you don't want them up all night worrying about causing illness for granny and granddad. So again, that pacing and involving them at a level that they can developmentally, emotionally, and psychologically manage. And finally, it's just about being supportive. And one of the things we misunderstand about support is that supportive isn't about being agreeable. Supportive isn't about being their friend. Supportive isn't about doing what they want. Supporting them is about being there for them when they need you, scaffolding them, and allowing them to manage, allowing them to experience failure, experience boredom, but to know that you're there with them and to believe in them. And it's that belief, and it's something that we need to be very careful of, because we don't overinflate the belief of children to the point where they perhaps are naive and become kind of crushed when life doesn't throw some adversity at them. But we do need to really try and tune into the idea that we have their back, and it's not about that nothing bad will happen, but if something happens, that you are there for them. And it really is. And I would say to you, the last thing I'll mention is children are supposed to be difficult. That is part of their role. And I oftentimes people would say to me, "Oh, you're a child psychotherapist, you must have perfect children." And I would always say, "No, I don't, thank God." And from the point of view, I don't want perfect children. From the point of view of they're supposed to be imperfect, they're supposed to get it wrong, they're supposed to test, they're supposed to find that out. And a child who is overly compliant, and when you're doing an assessment and somebody says, "Oh, I don't think I've ever had to raise my voice to her in her whole life," that would send red flags off in me. And so and this is maybe some solace, when you're arguing with your child or trying to debate something or trying to negotiate something, that's the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be like that. And I think I'll finish with this, and I always include this in nearly every talk that I give, but there's a very simple formula for happiness. Expectation minus reality equals happiness. So if your parental expectations are up here, but your reality is down here, that's the degree to which you'll feel not enough. And sometimes it's not about changing reality, but it is about adjusting our expectations. And despite what the avocado police will tell us, parenting is simple, it's just not easy. And I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Colman. Hopefully you can hear questions now. We've got over 80 questions and we've got very little time. So what I'll say first of all is that we've got a number of questions about online safety and anxious children. So we're doing sessions specifically on those issues in the coming weeks. So we might leave those questions to those sessions just to try and work our way through. Just before we start on particular questions, a number of parents, Colman, are confused about your cornflake bowl story.
Okay.
So you might just clarify a little bit about the cornflakes.
Yeah, I think from the point of view of when somebody is misbehaving, we try and fix what's causing them to feel that way. So the issue there in that scenario is that child is coming into the room upset. The cornflake thing is the straw that broke the camel's back. It is, and oftentimes when we think about symptoms in terms of mental health symptoms, the symptom is not the problem. The symptom is the child's answer to the problem. So if your child struggles with eating, or your child has an obsessive need to clean their hands, or your child is self-harming or hurting themselves, we tend to focus on the problem, and see that as the problem. That's the signpost to the problem. That's not the problem itself. So that outburst that child has over the cornflakes, it's nothing got to do with that. This is something that is going on for her. And so parking the issue around what's just happened and trying to understand why it is she reacted in that way, and trying to interpret the behavior by allowing her time to speak and to offer her opportunity and allowing her to feel heard is more effective than just fixing the thing by getting more cornflakes. Does that make sense?
Okay. Hopefully that clarifies that for people. Okay, so the first question then is, how do you bring a 9-year-old down from a temperament number of 8, 9, 10 without being seen to giving in?
A temperament of 8, 9, 10 probably means a high temperament, so kind of a robust, reactive, emotionally I think from the point of view of, I would see that as a language issue. So I think this child needs a way in which they can describe how they feel, rather than showing how they feel through behavior. And again, it goes back to that idea of visibility and communication. And sometimes children who are very bright, and they might be well able to read, and they have very good maths, and they might be very intellectually bright, the emotionality or their emotional intelligence can be quite low. And so sometimes an immaturity around that is children get missed because they seem to be really bright on an intellectual level, but actually they haven't got a lot of language that describes how they feel. So they tend to behave and act out how they feel. So in order to convey to people around me that I'm upset or I'm angry or I'm frustrated or I'm struggling, I need to behave and act out in that way to do that. So if you see that that behavior is trying to communicate something to you, what I would say with that person is trying to develop language around emotion, try and get them, and that sounds like a real complicated thing. It's not. In terms of reading stories, asking them, how do you think that character feels? Watching something on TV, pausing it and kind of going through what that might, how an action might make you feel. What is it like to be sad? What is it like to be happy? What is it like to be frustrated? And it's about creating the language around that they can then volunteer to you how they feel, which preempts the tantrum taking place. What we tend to do in that situation is trying to regulate the tantrum by putting in sanctions or disciplines or giving in because we dread the tantrum. But the issue is, and oftentimes I've heard this a lot, where people say when he doesn't get his own way, it goes wrong. Absolutely, if that's the case, that is an emotional dysregulation issue. But that doesn't mean give him his own way and don't let it. It is about being persistent, and sometimes that means going against the plan. So if you're going to the park for the day and he kicks off, you go home, because the message learned in that is more important than the trip to the park. And so oftentimes what we do is, true to the pester power, we relent and give in after a certain amount of the heightened misbehavior. And that just shows the child a way that this is the way that I achieve things. And at 9, it's no different to being 2. Do you know what I mean, from the point of view of that? And it is about consistently, for a period of time, not rewarding the behavior, but equally you have to provide them with a language. You have to provide them with a coping. So those tantrums are a signpost to the problem as opposed to being the problem, in my view.
Okay, thanks very much. Just, we might try and keep the answers a bit briefer if
Sorry,
you can, and just on the basis that I can get through maybe a bit more questions, because we're getting short on time. Okay, saying that, I'm probably asking you very complicated things that don't easily answer. So the next one is, how do parents have confidence in stepping back and allowing the child control their own actions and choices? When so many parents step in to save their child from making mistakes, it's hard to allow your child to fail and learn themselves.
Very difficult. I think from the point of view of the responsibility, we have to teach responsibility. So you have to allow a child to fail. And from the point of view, in terms of that, what I'd say to you is, if your child is on their way, you can give them advice, you can give them guidance, but again, getting away from prescribing what to do, because that disables the child from making their own decisions. And what I would say to you is, a lot of teenagers in contemporary world really struggle with decisions. Decisions they overwhelm them because they're used to contracting the decision out. So it's, rather than just allowing your child to fail in a kind of epic form, it's about gradually giving them more and more responsibility to make decisions and allowing them to make little mistakes first before making the kind of epic ones. And, you know, as a parent, it's very hard, because sometimes we just have a way of being that if somebody's doing something, they say, "Mom, what do you think of this?" or "Dad, what do you think of that?" and say, "That's great, but you should have done it this way." And we change it for them. So it's about allowing the smaller stuff for them to fail at gradually integrating the bigger stuff, and then into friendships and relationships and choices. But we have to teach children how to make decisions, because I think what we do is we kind of can de-skill them by over decision making for them.
Okay, thank you. What extra support does an only child need?
I think from the point of view of only children, it's not a thing that I would ever pathologize as some sort of an issue. I mean, and I wouldn't say to you, "Oh, I've seen so many only children in my career," more so than anything else. The issue is it's about socializing, it's about sharing, it's about connection, it's about probably the things that you would learn through a sibling relationship. And again, what you're trying to do that is just trying to replicate that through friendships and social situations. So it's about finding their tribe outside of the home. And again, I suppose one of the big issues that we've seen over the lockdown period was children who became kind of de-skilled socially from being isolated. And so they became avoidant of engaging in behaviors, and they lost a lot of the skills around sharing, turn taking, things like that. And they had to kind of find their way back when they returned to the kind of normality of structure. But I think from an only child point of view, it's just about allowing them to engage in the social world outside with their peers. And, you know, the school, the laboratory of life will teach us about that stuff. So I don't think there's anything as a parent you have to do extra, but it probably just a little bit of more awareness of perhaps things that they're not exposed to, like sharing, turn taking, etc.
Okay. What age would you expect a child to be able to regulate emotions themselves, and how do you know when it's a problem that needs professional help?
Okay, about 24. The issue around self-regulation is going to be anything with age is always arbitrary when it comes to child and adolescence. There's one 13-year-old and another can be vastly different. Children tend to be dysregulated up to the age of 7, 8, 9. 11, 12, it becomes much more concrete. So the world becomes much more black and white, and then they become kind of more tantrumy and dysregulated in teenage years again. So, I mean, really, in terms of, I think 18 or 19 years of age before they start to master it to a degree. But obviously you're hoping that it's getting better as it goes. The second part of that question was what?
I've got to find it now. And when do you know when you need the problem needs professional help?
When it starts to really persistently affect functioning. So things like their school performance, and I'd look out for things like the biological indicators, so sleep, appetite, weight loss, weight gain, that sort of stuff. Keep an eye on that. The psychological factors, if they're really negative about themselves and getting into kind of very negative cycles of thinking, and then obviously the social side, if they're starting to struggle with peer groups or not being able to mix and not being able to go to the things they used to be able to do. Anything that there's a kind of a detour from the baseline that's enduring and is affecting their functioning, then it's something that they need help. But transient problems and mental distress is really normal. And again, trying to ride that out a little bit and seeing if it's getting better is well worth it, rather than over pathologizing things.
Okay, thank you. Just the last couple of questions that we've got time for now then. You say consistency is more important than style. My partner is consistent, but is very strict with my child and consistently shouting. I don't agree with that style of parenting. What should I do?
Yeah, I mean, again, when I say style, I mean, obviously a style that's within the realms of something that's effective, and shouting isn't effective. What we know is that gets back to that reacting and responding thing that we're talking about. If you're very reactionary, your shouting becomes white noise to children. And one of the things I'd say to you is, fear is a very effective way of getting children to do what we want them to do, but it's absolutely ineffective at actually promoting any degree of understanding. And when we're trying to say what we want to do is the child to understand their world and understand themselves, shouting doesn't work in that way. But where you're saying that you have one approach and your husband has another, it is trying to, I think maybe if you're overly lenient, maybe saying, well, I'll step up and I'll be a bit more bad cop in this way, but you have to step down. And so that's a parenting conversation that two people over the table agree to move their positions, because when you're polarized, all you'll do is become, the stricter he is, the more lenient you'll become, because you're trying to compensate. So that's where the behaviors get split and you become polarized parents, and that just becomes utterly confusing for the child.
Okay, and we'll just finish up on this question then. What is your advice on parents to maintain our own emotional and mental condition so we can parent our kids better?
I think from the point of view of and this is a tough one at the moment, but we have to find our own joy. And I think it is about trying to engage in the world. Like, there's enough stress out there. There's really tough things going on, and I think from the point of view of what we see, what our children see in us, is oftentimes when we're tired, we're stressed, and when they're small, we're getting up in the morning when we're really stressed, and we're putting them to bed when we're really tired. And I think there's an element of us having to, and it sounds kind of cliche, but that self-care element. You need your own time to replenish, to break down, to break out a little bit, whether it's through sport or walking. And I understand. And lots of the things that we do for mental fitness are limited at the moment because of the circumstances. But this won't last forever, and we will get back to that. But minding your own mental well-being is about keeping mentally fit, and that's about doing things that you enjoy. It's about having a life outside of your children, and getting the right amount of, obviously, the sleep and appetite and all that sort of stuff will help. But it is about self-care. It's just about making time for yourself, because happy people make happy parents.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that we've run out of time. So one of the things that we're very sure about is keeping these 2 times so parents can put the time aside, which I know is very difficult. So we don't want to run over on our time. So I would like to say thank you to Colman, and hopefully that we'll see all of you next week. The registration for next week's session is still live, and for the next 3 sessions is still live. So if people want to register or know somebody else who'd be interested in it, they can register up until this day next week, actually, for next week's session. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Okay, thank you.